On my 62nd birthday, my own son looked me in the eye and said, "Pack your things." No argument, no explanation worth hearing, just those 3 words, sharp enough to slice through every ounce of hope I had left. He didn't know that with one phone call, I could change everything he thought he controlled. I had been gone for 20 years, missed birthdays, graduations, the nights he needed me most. I came back with nothing but the truth, a suitcase, and the desperate hope that maybe we could start over. For a while, it seemed possible. Dinners at the same table, laughter over stories from the past, even a bond with my grandson I never thought I'd have. But behind every smile, my son was waiting for the right moment to cut me out for good. What he didn't realize was that I had one final card to play, a piece of paper locked away for decades with a signature that could stop him in his tracks. The moment he told me to leave, I made a single call. No shouting, no begging, just a quiet conversation with someone who'd been waiting for this day as long as I had. Before this story ends, you'll see how betrayal can twist into justice, how a single decision can rewrite a family's future, and how forgiveness sometimes isn't the ending we think it is. I stepped off the bus with a single duffel bag slung over my shoulder and the kind of nervous energy that made my palms sweat despite the late autumn chill. 20 years. That was how long it had been since I'd last walked these streets. The grocery store had a new sign. The old diner was gone, and the maple tree on the corner, where I used to wait for Ethan after school, was taller, broader, as if it had been quietly living its life without me. The last time I saw my son, he was 10 years old, standing in the driveway with his arms crossed, refusing to wave goodbye. I told myself I was leaving for a better job offshore, that I'd send money and visit when I could. But when I could turned into never. The work was brutal, the distance heavier than I imagined, and when his mother died in a car accident 3 years later, I was too ashamed to show my face at the funeral. That shame turned into years of silence, broken only by the occasional letter I never had the courage to mail. Now, at 62, my hands were more calloused than I remembered. My back ached from years at sea, and my bank account was nearly empty. But I wasn't here for money. I was here because I couldn't bear the thought of dying without trying to fix what I broke. Ethan had a son now, my grandson, and I'd never seen him. That thought alone had kept me awake on long, sleepless nights in tiny port towns. When Ethan opened the door, the look in his eyes wasn't anger. It was calculation. He took in my worn coat, the streaks of gray in my hair, the way I stood like a man expecting to be turned away. For a moment, I thought he might slam the door. Instead, he stepped aside. "You can stay in the guest room, for now," he said. His voice was flat, controlled, as if he was doing a favor for someone else, not for me. The first week was cautious. We didn't speak much beyond polite exchanges about the weather or what time dinner would be. His wife, Claire, was polite but distant, her eyes constantly darting between us like she was monitoring a fragile ceasefire. My grandson, Liam, was curious but shy, peeking at me from behind door frames before darting away when I smiled. It wasn't until the second week that cracks in the ice began to form. One evening, after Ethan came home late from work, we ended up sitting at the same table for dinner. Claire had made roast chicken, and Liam was fascinated by the little stories I told about fishing on stormy nights or spotting whales from the deck. Ethan listened quietly, his fork moving mechanically, but every so often his eyes flicked up at me, measuring, weighing. We began to share small moments. I repaired the loose hinge on the back door without being asked, fixed the squeaky ceiling fan in Liam's room. And one rainy Saturday, I found myself in the living room, building a Lego spaceship with my grandson, while Ethan watched from the couch. For the first time in 2 decades, it felt like I was part of a family again. But there was something in Ethan's demeanor that never softened completely. His laughter was polite, his nods measured. And sometimes, when he thought I wasn't looking, his gaze hardened as if he were reminding himself of something I'd done. It wasn't open hostility. It was colder than that. It was the quiet reserve of someone who hadn't made up his mind whether you belonged in his life. One night, after Liam had gone to bed, Ethan and I sat in the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. "I know why you're here," he said finally, his eyes fixed on the table. "You think you can make up for 20 years with a few nice dinners and fixing things around the house." I opened my mouth to answer, but he held up a hand. "I'm letting you stay because I want to see who you really are now. Not because I've forgiven you." The words were a gut punch, but I nodded. I had no right to demand forgiveness. "Then let me prove who I am," I said quietly. He didn't respond. He just got up, rinsed his cup, and walked away, leaving me alone at the table with the steady hum of the fridge and the realization that I was on probation in my own son's home. I told myself it was a start. The change in Ethan's tone was subtle, but I could feel it in the way he avoided eye contact for the next few days. Something had shifted between us after that night in the kitchen, though I couldn't tell if it was progress or a step backward. One Saturday morning, I found him sitting alone in the backyard, staring at the fence with a mug of coffee in his hands. The air was heavy with the scent of wet leaves from the rain the night before. I took a seat on the opposite end of the bench, careful not to crowd him. "I used to sit here with Mom," he said without looking at me. "She'd drink tea. I'd have hot chocolate. Sometimes she'd cry. I never asked why, but I knew it was about money. She tried to hide it, but kids aren't stupid." My stomach tightened. I remembered those years, the endless letters from creditors, the way every paycheck vanished before it even cleared. "I never wanted to leave her with that," I said. But when the shipyard closed, I had nothing. No work, no savings. I thought if I went offshore, I could make it right. I told myself I'd be back in a year. "You weren't back in a year," he said flatly. "I wasn't," I admitted. "Then your mom. She was gone, and I was drowning in debt, ashamed of the man I'd become. I couldn't stand the thought of walking back into town with nothing to give you but more disappointment." For the first time, he looked at me, not with the guarded suspicion I'd grown used to, but with something softer, almost questioning. "You think hiding made it better?" "No," I said. "It made it worse. That's why I'm here now." The conversation ended there, but I could feel a thread of understanding forming, fragile as a spider's web. The next week, while Ethan was at work, I went up to the attic to look through some old boxes. There were pieces of our family life packed away in dusty cardboard. Liam's baby clothes, photo albums, a chipped coffee mug I remembered his mother using every morning. In one box, wrapped in a faded scarf, was her silver locket. Inside was a tiny photo of Ethan at age 6, grinning with a missing front tooth. I held it for a long time before tucking it back where I found it. That evening, Ethan came home earlier than usual. His eyes darted immediately to the small wooden shelf in the living room, where the locket had always been displayed since I'd returned. It wasn't there. "Where's Mom's locket?" he asked, his voice sharp. I hesitated. "I sold it this afternoon." The color drained from his face. "You sold it? For what?" "There's a debt I needed to settle." "It was important," I said, keeping my tone even. His hands clenched at his sides. "You've been here a month, and you're already pawning her things. I knew letting you stay was a mistake." He didn't speak to me for the rest of the night. The air in the house thickened with unspoken anger, and even Liam seemed to sense the tension, choosing to play quietly in his room instead of sitting with me in the living room. I spent that night lying awake, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the locket's absence pressing down on me. But in the drawer of the nightstand beside my bed, wrapped in the same faded scarf, the real locket rested safely. The one I had sold was a replica, a piece I'd had made years ago, anticipating a day when I might need to protect the original. I hadn't told Ethan because I knew he wouldn't believe me. Not yet. This wasn't about money. The sale was a way to settle a debt with an old crewmate, a man who had once risked his life for mine in the middle of a storm. It was the kind of debt that couldn't be ignored. Still, I felt the crack widening between us again. Whatever small progress we'd made in the backyard had been erased, replaced by the cold, watchful silence from the first days of my return. I told myself that time might heal it, but deep down, I knew it would take more than time. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I began to wonder if Ethan's guardedness wasn't just about my past, but about something else entirely. Something he hadn't said out loud. The morning of my 62nd birthday started quietly. Claire made pancakes for Liam before school, and Ethan left early for work without a word about the date. I told myself I didn't need a celebration. After all, birthdays had never been a big thing for me. But deep down, I hoped for some small acknowledgement. By late afternoon, the sky had turned gray, and a steady drizzle tapped against the windows. Ethan came home just as I was setting the table for dinner. He didn't take off his coat. He didn't sit down. Instead, he stood in the doorway of the kitchen, his hands in his pockets, and said, "Pack your things." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard. "What?" "You've been here long enough," he said evenly. "We need the space. It's getting too crowded." I looked at him, searching for the anger or frustration that might explain his words, but his face was blank, almost rehearsed. "If this is about the locket—" "It's not just the locket," he cut in. "It's everything. This isn't working. I think it's better if we just stop pretending." The words hit harder than I expected. I'd known I wasn't forgiven, but I thought there was still a chance. Some small thread connecting us. Now, it felt like he was cutting it clean. I didn't argue. There was no point in begging for space in a home where I wasn't wanted. "When do you want me gone?" I asked. "By tomorrow." That was it. No raised voices, no dramatic confrontation. Just a sentence that erased weeks of tentative progress. I went to the guest room and began folding my clothes, moving slowly, methodically. My hands trembled as I packed the duffel bag I'd arrived with. Each shirt, each pair of socks felt like a reminder of how temporary I'd been in this house. As I reached for the drawer of the nightstand, my eyes lingered on the sealed envelope I'd been keeping hidden since the day I arrived. It was thick, heavy with papers and something else. Something I knew Ethan wasn't expecting. I hesitated, then slipped it into my jacket pocket and carried it with me to his study. The room was quiet, the desk neat except for a stack of bills and a laptop. I opened the top drawer slid the envelope inside, and pushed it to the back where it wouldn't be found right away. No note, no explanation, just the envelope. I stood there for a moment, my hand resting on the wood, listening to the muffled sound of Claire and Liam talking in the kitchen. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to breathe slowly. When I returned to the guest room, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the half-packed bag. A part of me wanted to walk out right then, disappear without another word. But another part, the part that had made that one quiet phone call weeks earlier, knew patience was a stronger weapon. Ethan didn't check on me that night. I heard the muffled sound of the television downstairs, then the creak of the stairs as he and Claire went to bed. The house settled into silence. I lay there in the dark, the rain still tapping at the windows, wondering how we had arrived at this point so quickly. In the quiet, my mind replayed the small moments we'd shared. Liam's laughter, Ethan's guarded glances softening for just a second, and I wondered if any of it had been real, or if he'd been counting down the days all along. By morning, my bag was zipped, my coat folded over my arm. I'd already arranged for a cab to take me to a small apartment complex on the edge of town. As I stepped into the hallway, Ethan was at the kitchen counter, sipping coffee. He didn't offer to help with my bag, didn't ask where I was going. "Take care of yourself," I said quietly. He nodded, eyes fixed on his mug. "You too." No hug, no handshake, just the sound of the door closing behind me, and the knowledge that somewhere in that study drawer, the envelope waited. Whether it was a gift, a warning, or something else entirely, only time would tell. The cab pulled away from Ethan's street, the rain-washed houses fading into the distance. I sat in the back seat, my duffel bag at my feet, and pulled an old flip phone from my jacket pocket. The number I dialed was one I hadn't called in more than 15 years, but my fingers found it without hesitation. "Davidson Law," came the familiar voice on the other end. "Paul, it's John Miller." There was a pause, then a warm chuckle. I wondered if this day would come. "I think it just did," I said. "I need to know if what we talked about back then still holds." He didn't ask for details. He'd been the one to help me and my late wife buy that house all those years ago. He knew every signature, every clause. "I'll have to check the deed," he said, papers rustling in the background. "But unless something changed without your consent, you should still be on it." My grip tightened on the phone. I never signed anything, not to remove my name. "That's what I thought," Paul said. "Which means your son's been living in a house that's still half yours." A slow heat rose in my chest. Not the bitter burn of humiliation I'd felt when Ethan told me to leave, but something sharper, more controlled. "What do we do next?" "You leave that to me. I'll draft the necessary paperwork. They won't be able to make a move without your approval." By the time the cab dropped me at a small apartment complex near the docks, I felt lighter, though I hadn't unpacked a thing. Paul called back that evening with confirmation. My name was still on the title. He'd already prepared documents to formally freeze any sale or transfer until the ownership dispute was resolved. The next morning, those documents were on their way to Ethan's mailbox via certified mail, with copies sent to the county clerk's office. 2 days later, my phone rang. I didn't answer. It rang again an hour after that. This time, I listened to the voicemail. Ethan's voice, tense and clipped. "Dad, I just got some legal notice about the house. I don't know what this is, but we need to talk." I let it sit. By the third day, his tone had shifted from irritation to panic. "Dad, this is serious. They're saying we have to stop the sale. We can't. Look, I just need to understand what's going on. Please call me back." I didn't. Paul kept me updated. The paperwork had effectively locked the property, meaning Ethan and Claire couldn't move forward with whatever plans they had. Plans I now suspected had been in motion long before my birthday. On the 5th day, Ethan showed up at the apartment building. I saw him from the window, standing in the parking lot, scanning the numbers on the doors. I stayed quiet, the curtains drawn. He knocked on my door for nearly 10 minutes, alternating between calling my name and standing in silence. Finally, he left, his footsteps slow, shoulders tense. That evening, Paul called again. "They're scrambling," he said. "Looks like they were in the middle of negotiating a sale. The buyers backed out now that the title's frozen. My guess? They were counting on that money for something urgent." I didn't ask what. It didn't matter. For the first time since I'd come back, I wasn't the one reacting to Ethan's decisions. He was reacting to mine. It wasn't about revenge. Not entirely. It was about balance. About reminding him that I wasn't some old man he could push aside without consequence. That night, I sat by the small window in my apartment, watching the rain turn to mist over the harbor lights. Somewhere across town, Ethan was realizing that the man he'd told to pack your things still had a key piece of the life he thought he controlled. And that was just the beginning. For nearly a week, the envelope sat in the back of Ethan's desk drawer, right where I'd left it. I imagined him noticing it every time he reached for a pen or a receipt, wondering what it was, wondering if opening it would give him leverage over me, or hand me some unexpected power. It was on the 7th evening that he finally broke. Ethan came home late, the house quiet, except for the hum of the fridge. Claire was in the living room, curled up with a blanket, watching some reality show with the volume low. He walked past her without a word, went into his study, and closed the door. The click of the latch was soft, but decisive. He sat at the desk, staring at the drawer for a long minute before pulling it open. The envelope looked heavier than it was, the thick cream paper slightly worn from being handled. He ran his thumb along the seal, hesitating. Finally, he tore it open. The first thing he saw was a photograph. His mother, mid-laugh, sunlight in her hair, holding a cup of tea in one hand. It was a candid shot, the kind you couldn't pose for, taken in the backyard on some forgotten summer afternoon. Ethan felt something twist in his chest. He hadn't seen her look that alive in decades, not since before the worry lines, before the years of waiting for a husband who didn't come home. Beneath the photo was a single sheet of legal paper. The heading read, "Transfer of Property Ownership." His eyes skimmed the words, trying to process them. It was a formal, notarized statement transferring my share of the house entirely to him. No strings, no payment, on one condition. The condition was written in plain, unadorned language. Grantor retains the right to reside in one room of the property for the remainder of his life. Ethan sat back in his chair, staring at the paper. He read it again, slower this time, making sure there wasn't some hidden clause or trick. There wasn't. His jaw tightened. Part of him bristled at the manipulation, because that's what it felt like. I'd frozen the sale, cornered him legally, then revealed I wasn't trying to take the house from him at all. I just wanted a place under the same roof. And yet, the other part of him. It wasn't anger. It was something heavier. Something that sat behind his ribs, pressing inward. He closed his eyes, And for the first time in years, memories of me as I'd been before the leaving came uninvited. Sitting at the kitchen table, helping him with math homework, cheering from the sidelines at his soccer games, fixing his bike chain in the driveway while he chattered about school. Those moments had been real, even if they'd been swallowed by the years that followed. He folded the paper, slid it back into the envelope, and sat there for a long time with his fingers pressed against the flap. When he finally stood, he didn't know if he was angrier at me for forcing him into this choice or at himself for not knowing what to do. The next day, while Claire took Liam to school, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, scrolling through bank statements. That's when he saw it, a payment marked loan payoff from an account he didn't recognize. It had been processed 3 weeks earlier, the exact day I'd gone into town alone. The amount made his breath catch, $27,843. The outstanding balance on the personal loan he and Claire had taken out last year when their business nearly folded. Ethan checked again. The payment had been sent directly from my account. His chair scraped loudly against the floor as he stood. For a moment, he just stood there in the kitchen, one hand gripping the back of the chair, the other hanging useless at his side. The realization came slowly but relentlessly. While he'd been stewing over my power play with the house, I'd been quietly keeping him afloat. It didn't make sense. Why would I pay off his debt and then use the deed to pressure him into letting me stay? Unless it wasn't pressure at all. Unless it was the only way I knew how to ask to be part of his life again. The idea made him sit down again, his heartbeat loud in his ears. He thought about the photograph in the envelope, about his mother's smile, about the way I'd never once raised my voice since coming back. He thought about Liam and how the boy had started to look for me when he came home from school, about the Lego spaceship still sitting on the living room shelf. By the time Claire returned, Ethan was still at the table, the envelope beside him, unopened since the night before, but now feeling heavier than ever. "You okay?" she asked, setting her purse down. He nodded slowly, though he didn't look up. "Yeah, just thinking." That night, Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling in the dark. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that number, 27,843, and the neat, simple handwriting on the deed transfer. He couldn't decide if I'd outmaneuvered him or given him the kind of olive branch he'd never expected. What he did know was this: the story he'd told himself for 20 years, that I'd left because I didn't care, wasn't holding up as neatly as it used to. And that was almost harder to accept than the alternative. 3 days after Ethan discovered the truth about the loan, he came to my apartment. I'd just finished washing a plate in the sink when I heard the knock. When I opened the door, he stood there without a jacket, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, eyes tired but clear. "Come back to the house," he said simply. It caught me off guard. "Ethan, I know I haven't made it easy. I know I've been waiting for you to fail, but you didn't. You've done more than I thought you would, more than I thought you could." His voice faltered, but he didn't look away. "I want you there. I want Liam to have you there." I studied his face, the sincerity in his words, the way his shoulders slumped as if carrying something heavy. Then I shook my head. "No." His brow creased. "Why not?" "Because I don't want to be in your home as an obligation or a condition," I said. "I have a place now. It's not much, but it's mine. And I'm close enough to see you whenever we want. I don't want to live with you because I have to. I want us to choose to see each other. For a moment, he looked like he might argue, but then he nodded slowly. All right, we'll do it your way. From then on, we found a rhythm. Saturday mornings, I'd join them for breakfast. Wednesdays, after school, Liam would come to my apartment to work on puzzles or build something from scraps I'd collected. Some weeks, Ethan and I would talk for hours. Other weeks, we barely said much at all, but it was enough. The silence between us had shifted. It no longer carried the weight of resentment, but the comfort of knowing we were rebuilding on our own terms. The seasons changed. Winter melted into spring, and with it came small but steady repairs to the bridge we'd both abandoned years ago. On the morning of my 63rd birthday, I expected nothing more than a quiet dinner with them. I arrived at the house, knocked, and was met by the sound of voices. Many voices. When Ethan opened the door, the living room was full. Neighbors, old friends, even a few faces I barely remembered from before I left. Balloons hung from the ceiling. A long table was set with food, and a cake sat in the center with candles already lit. "What's all this?" I asked, genuinely stunned. "It's for you," Ethan said, smiling for real this time. "You've spent too many birthdays alone, not this year." As the room quieted, he picked up his glass and turned to face everyone. "Most of you know my father came back into my life last year. What you don't know is how much that's changed me. I spent a long time angry, convinced he'd never done anything for me. I was wrong." He glanced at me, and his voice grew steadier. "He didn't just come back. He fought for the chance to make things right. And in doing that, he taught me something I didn't think I'd believe again. That forgiveness is never too late." For a moment, no one moved. Then the room filled with applause, warm and unrestrained. I felt something in my chest loosen, a knot I hadn't realized I'd been holding since the day I left Ethan as a boy. Liam ran up and hugged my waist, grinning up at me. "Happy birthday, Grandpa." I put a hand on his head, my throat too tight to speak. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of laughter, handshakes, and the kind of conversations I thought I'd lost forever. As I blew out the candles, I didn't make a wish. I realized I already had what I'd been wishing for all along.